Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Dr. Elena Traister in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA. And we're so glad that you're joining us for another one of our Green Living Seminar presentations. This semester, the theme is Rewilding Our World, and these presentations are all free and open to the public. They take place here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation, room 121, Wednesdays at 5:30 p.m. You can find the schedule to upcoming presentations on our website at www.mcla.edu/greenliving, one word. Today's presentation will go until 6:30 or so. And before I introduce our speaker, I want to invite you to all come back again next week. On Wednesday, March 5th, Paul Catanzaro, UMass professor and state extension forester, will present a lecture titled Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to Forests of New England. Today's presentation, titled The Return of the Wolf to the Northeast, will be given by Renee Seacor. Renee currently serves as Carnivore Conservation Director at Project Coyote, where she works to advocate and advance policy solutions aimed at compassionately coexisting with our wild carnivore neighbors nationwide. Renee is an interdisciplinary environmental advocate with a background in wildlife ecology and environmental law and policy. She holds a BS in environmental science from Rocky Mountain College in Montana and a JD with a concentration in environmental law from the University of Oregon School of Law. Thanks so much for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Elena, for inviting me and all of you for having me here this evening. Reintroduce myself. Renee Seacor, I'm the Carnivore Conservation Director at an organization called Project Coyote. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Project Coyote, we're a national nonprofit, and our mission is to protect North America's wild carnivores and promote compassionate coexistence with North American carnivores through education, science, advocacy, and coalition building. It's a little bit of a tongue twister, so I always get hung up on it. So our work really aims at our organization to kind of fundamentally shift the way that North America wild carnivore species like coyotes, wolves, bears, bobcats, and others are viewed and treated across North America, and foster coexistence with them, which in turn creates thriving ecosystems because of their benefits to our ecosystems. So just to give a bit of background, so we work on that in a variety of ways. Our organization has kind of three key programmatic areas. We protect, coexist, and try to inspire as well. So our protect campaigns are focused on advocacy and policy initiatives to protect North America's wild carnivores. An example of that work is our work to ban wildlife killing contests. So if you're unfamiliar with these are kind of competitive killing events that target primarily carnivore species, most commonly coyotes, and award prizes and trophies for killing the most coyotes at a given weekend or the largest coyote. But out west, they also target wolves, mountain lions, and other species, other carnivores as well. We also have our coexist programs, which really work to work on education and outreach initiatives to help people coexist with their wild carnivore neighbors. So one of our programs in that area is our Coyote Friendly Communities program. So it works with urban and suburban communities on teaching people how they can coexist with coyotes that they see in their communities and run into on a daily basis. And then we also have our Inspire programmatic area, which collaborates with educators and creatives just really to foster and inspire appreciation for just wild nature and wild carnivores in general. So we work with a lot of wildlife photographers on promoting images and experiences that they see in the field when interacting or just observing wild carnivores. So together, these really, we work to create a framework for fostering coexistence. And there, like I said before, really, by coexisting with wild carnivores, we produce better thriving ecosystems across the country. So when Elena invited me to speak at North Adams, I'd start with a personal story. So when Elena invited me to speak, I was trying to remember why I knew North Adams. And then I realized that I think I lodged through this town when I tried to hike the Appalachian Trail. And I say tried because I unsuccessfully hiked the Appalachian Trail. But I started a southbound hike in 2015. So I started up in Maine, and I did make it 500 miles, which I consider, in retrospect, more than I'll probably ever hike again. But I did stop in North Adams. I think I remember coming in and hitchhiking my way into North Adams and probably getting a shower and doing my laundry in this town. But I just wanted to share that story because I grew up in the Northeast. I grew up in New York in Westchester County. And when I left for college after high school, I really wanted to move out west. And I think that was because in my head, wilderness and wild landscapes really only existed in the western United States. And so I, at the time, moved west, studied at Rocky Mountain College in Billings, Montana, super small liberal arts school in like the Great Plains in like eastern Montana, which is really random. But it was also a very cool experience because I got to study in the greater Yellowstone River ecosystem. And so I really got to be introduced to a landscape that was teeming with, wolves and grizzly bears and mountain lions and all these top carnivore species that didn't exist in the Northeast. And it started, I guess, this journey of asking some questions of why that is and how that affects our ecosystems at large when we don't have those top carnivores that once existed. So to get into the topic of our talk today about wolves and kind of their return and thinking about their return to the Northeast, I'm going to pivot kind of backwards to just give a quick, hopefully brief, historical perspective on how we got to where we are today. So it's important, I think, to ground ourselves in this history because it relates to where we're going and thinking about wolf recovery in the future. So historically, wolves ranged across most of North America, and this map shows their historical range pre-1800s, as well as their current range, which is the darker orange color. So during the 19th and 20th centuries, wolves and wild carnivores in general faced what were known as predator extermination campaigns through the middle of the last century. And the reasons behind these targeted eradication efforts were really European worldviews that devalued and vilified wolves. Wolves were often portrayed as dangerous, evil creatures in European folklore and culture, which was a perception that unfortunately carried over to the Americas with European colonization. And so that really fueled fear toward wild carnivores and wolves specifically, and also attempted to justify their extermination efforts. They were also perceived as a threat to domesticated farmed animals, which also came with European colonization, and also perceived as a threat to wild ungulate species and game species. And this was interesting because despite those predator and prey species living in balance for millennia before European colonization, they were kind of perceived as a threat to those species. So these fears and misconceptions led to both federal and state governments issuing what were known as bounties to incentivize wolf killing, as well as other species like coyotes, mountain lions. So the federal government essentially paid for private individuals to go out and kill wolves and paid them $10, $15, $20 if they brought back in the hide or the head of a wolf. This eradication effort essentially eradicated wolves from all of the lower 48 by the 1930s, and there was only a handful of gray wolves that were left by the 1970s in Minnesota and in upper Michigan. And then the last wolf in the Northeast was really believed to be killed in New York during the 1890s. So hindsight 2020, after we eradicated wolves from most of North America, scientific discoveries between the 30s and the 60s really began to uncover the ecological value of wolves and top carnivores to our ecosystems. So I don't know exactly when the term keystone species, I was going to look this up and I forgot, but when keystone species was essentially founded as kind of an ecological term for those top carnivore species, but essentially wolves, species like wolves help keep entire ecosystems in balance by keeping prey species healthy and preventing things like overgrazing from happening. And we saw this happen in Yellowstone, right? So without wolves, elk populations exploded after wolves were kind of extirpated from the region. and their primary predator, elk, were able to, overgraze the northern range of Yellowstone National Park, overgrazing willows and aspen, and these trees were critical to species like beavers, who used willows and aspen for food and shelter and dam building. So with the eradication of wolves and the increase of elk, we saw a decrease of beaver, right? And beaver, another keystone species. And so with the decrease of beaver, dams disintegrated, turning marshy ponds into streams and removing that habitat from Yellowstone National Park. So just kind of explaining this as the trickle-down effect of removing a species like a wolf from an ecosystem and how that can have really, vast effects on the lower trophic levels of an ecosystem. So scientific discoveries, as we started to realize what the benefits of wolves to ecosystems at large, and how our ecosystems were suffering in their absence, those scientific discoveries really started to argue for wolves and recovery of wolves and their populations for ecosystems. And that protection was essentially achieved with the signing of the Endangered Species Act into law in 1974. And at that time, wolves were then listed as an endangered species. This ultimately led to reintroduction efforts in the Northern Rockies in the 1990s. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service ended up reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park and into Idaho, which is a more famous story of wolf reintroduction, so you probably are all familiar with that. But they also reintroduced Mexican gray wolves, which is a subspecies of gray wolf, into Arizona and New Mexico, which is the small orange blub at the bottom of that map. And they also reintroduced red wolves, actually starting in 1987, into North Carolina as well. So there were a few reintroduction efforts that happened during kind of the 90s as wolves were relisted and then reintroduced. And at the time of this kind of era of reintroduction, the Northeast was actually also considered a potential reintroduction site. And there were feasibility studies at the time that looked at Adirondack Park in particular as a large patch of protected land as a potential reintroduction site. And that was because, identified suitable habitat throughout the region, a really good prey base, and ultimately a good chance of potential recovery. Ultimately, they did not move forward with that reintroduction for numerous political and biological reasons, and I'll touch on those as I go through my talk. But overall, the reintroductions of the 90s were somewhat successful to an extent. Wolves were slowly able to recolonize a portion of their former range, and now they occupy about 10% of that former range at current. However, beginning in the 2000s, began really relentless attempts by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to delist wolves both regionally and nationally. And this affected the Northeast in particular, which obviously in the 90s, like I said, and early 2000s, was considered for potential reintroduction. And coalitions were really pushing for reintroduction at that time. And a lot of conservation organizations in the region were hopeful that wolves might be reintroduced in the Northeast. But as wolves began to recover in the Northern Rockies, as well as the Great Lakes, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service essentially delisted wolves and began attempting to lump the Northeast in with the Great Lakes in terms of recovery goals. So as wolves recovered in the Great Lakes, they kind of wrote off the Northeast as a potential for recovery and kind of called that good enough, that wolves were recovering in the Great Lakes. And I'm really simplifying this. There's a lot of lawsuits and listing and delisting and ping-ponging that's gone on, and wolves are one of the most heavily litigated species. So this is definitely an oversimplification, but just kind of where we're at the current moment. So one of the questions that arose at the time in that 90s, 2000, early 2000s era was kind of what species of wolf was native to the Northeast, and also what about the coyotes that had moved into this range in the absence of wolves. And there were, a lot of questions around whether coyotes had started to begin to fill kind of the ecological role that wolves were once serving as the new canid in town. And I'll just, we'll circle back to kind of that point, but just wanted to bring that up at this moment. So More recently, in early 2021, wolves were actually stripped of their federal protections again, and this kind of turned management over to the states. This ruling was eventually overturned pretty quickly in 2022. So at this very moment, gray wolves remain listed as endangered. So any wolf potentially dispersing into the Northeast does have federal protections. However, there's no commitment or efforts by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to really recover wolves in the Northeast at this time, and really no efforts at the state wildlife agency level either. So what about the Northeast? Is there actually suitable habitat here is a common question that I'll get. And recent studies in the last several decades, but even more recently, this is a 2022 study, continue to confirm that there is suitable habitat in the Northeast. This study found over 17,000 square miles of suitable wolf habitat in New England and New York, with about 11,000 square miles in New England and 5,700 square miles in New York alone. However, don't want to overstate this. Habitat fragmentation is obviously a continual issue, and connectivity for a species like wolves are so important for genetic dispersal and the ability to be able to move adequately throughout the landscape. So there's some really crucial, and this is another, tons of habitat suitability analyses that have been kind of looked at throughout the Northeast, and this is kind of overlaying those studies on identified habitat in this region. But yeah, those key wildlife corridors are going to be super important as we think about wolf recovery. And I don't know if you can see my mouse. Maybe not. But one of the most crucial ones is that Adirondack to Algonquin, which is a provincial park in southern Ontario, which is actually where the closest breeding population of wolves is to the Northeast. And so that's a really critical one in thinking about dispersal of breeding wolves into the Northeast. So what about these guys? So you can't talk about wolves. Well, I have to talk about coyotes. I guess we're Project Coyote, right? So maybe I'm biased, but you really can't talk about wolves in the Northeast without getting into a bit of taxonomic and genetic science. And I'm going to keep this on the briefer side because, one, I'm not a canid geneticist as much as I'm very fascinated by it, but we do work with some great canid genetic researchers from Princeton. Bridget Van Holt is a really pronounced canid geneticist who's doing some great work currently looking at the genetics of wild canis throughout the Northeast. So while the colonial war on wolves was happening and wolves really started disappearing from the lower 48 and the US, coyotes actually went in the opposite direction, and they had what was a range expansion. And this wasn't because coyotes were less targeted than wolves. They were trapped, hunted, poisoned. They also had bounties for coyotes as well. But there were there were certain factors that led to them persisting in the face of this kind of human extermination campaigns that wolves unfortunately had the opposite. So one of those reasons was that both wolves and coyotes are territorial species. So as wolves started disappearing from the landscape, coyotes were able to expand territories where they previously were restricted to. And so they were able to grow into wolves wolves territory. In addition to that, coyotes have this really incredible reproductive response to mortality, which is actually to increase their reproduction. And so the more that this is counterintuitive for most people, but the more that we hunt, trap, and kill them, coyotes actually are able to increase their populations in the face of that of that killing. And so what happens essentially, and this graphic kind of displays that, is there's a disruption of coyote social structure. And so it causes more pairs within a social structure to begin to breed when they have a loss of an individual. And then they'll actually have larger litter sizes as well. So super adaptable species, and in the face of intense mortality, they actually increase their populations. The last thing I'll say about coyotes too is that they have this ecological ability, which is called in ecological world, fission fusion, which is, wolves really rely on their pack for hunting and foraging and survival, whereas coyotes can, when they need to, live solitarily. They can break apart from their packs, and it kind of allows them to expand into places like the Central Park in New York City and Long Island and some of these newfound territories, because they don't require those large packs and they don't require large prey. They have a lot of adaptability in the prey that they can hunt, and living both in a pack or solitarily. So coyotes moved into the Northeast. As they were moving into the Northeast, wolves remained in southern Canada, and this included eastern wolves. And so this is just a depiction of kind of wild Canis in North America and how all these guys kind of compare in size. But eastern wolves essentially are a distinct population that is in southern Ontario. And so most of their population is restricted to Algonquin Provincial Park. And it's a little bit of a debate. In Canada, they're considered a separate species. In the US, they're considered a subspecies of gray wolf. Or still kind of genetic research figuring out where they land. But what we do know is that they're a unique genomic kind of structure. So they've evolved separately from gray wolves and coyotes. And that eastern wolf population in Algonquin Provincial Park and some of the surrounding areas, they are about, size-wise, about 60 to 70 pounds. So they're a little bit smaller than that typical western gray wolf, which can range from 90 to 130 pounds. And when you compare western coyotes to eastern coyotes, so western coyotes size-wise are about 20 to 30 pounds, but here in the east we have a larger bodied coyote, which is about 30 to 45 pounds, and we've seen animals up to 50, 55 pounds as well. And that, the reason for that is because there was this kind of collision that occurred as coyotes were coming in and wolves were being pushed off the landscape, and they started to admix, and so they started to hybridize and breed together. And this essentially created an admixed canid, which is our eastern coyote. Some call them coy wolf to try to explain some of that genetic uniqueness. So just focusing in on our eastern coyote for a second. So, obviously you guys, are probably familiar with the eastern coyote, but their DNA tells a very, interesting story of that range shifting and habitat change and persecution by humans that was happening, and it kind of resulted in this hybridization of multiple wild Canis species into one. And so some call our eastern coyote, eastern coyote, northeastern coyote. Some even use that term coy wolf. And what they're getting at is this unique genetic structure. And I'll zoom in on this study that was conducted at the time, pretty groundbreaking, in 2014, that found among 244 canids that were sampled for DNA in the Northeast, and their DNA was looked at compared to western gray wolf, eastern wolf, western coyote, and dog. They found that the eastern coyote, the coyote that ranges here in the Northeast, has about 62 to 65% coyote DNA, and then about 30% wolf DNA split between gray wolf and eastern wolf, and then about 10% dog DNA. So they're a little bit of a mutt. And they're genetically and morphologically very distinct from their western counterparts. I showed you that kind of size difference, right? So they're a larger bodied canid, and what's this resulted in is these really unique and very varied animals. So these are all images. When you work at Project Coyote, people send you a lot of pictures of a lot of different canids that they're seeing in their backyards and out on hikes, which is awesome. You can send me any picture of a wild canid. But these are all animals from the Northeast. Connecticut's on here, Vermont, New York, New Hampshire, Maine as well. So I think we've displayed canids from most states in the Northeast. But what you can see is that there's a lot of variability in these animals. And some look a bit more wolf-like. There are obviously difference in color traits, but overall a larger bodied canid than what we see in their kind of Western counterparts. And so we know that they look different. We know that they're larger. But there's been questions over how that displays itself in terms of the ecological role that coyotes are serving in the ecosystem. And so this wolf DNA also means that our coyotes that have wolf ancestry are serving a varied ecological role. And we talked about the beginning of, those ecological benefits of wolves on the landscape and the reintroductions that really, aim to restore ecological and ecosystem health by reintroducing wolves, right? Increased biodiversity, helped control those ungulate populations, helped beaver populations increase. And the question, is, are eastern coyotes doing that? And the answer in the Northeast is that they sort of are, right? We found that canids in packs that have been dominated by more wolf ancestry killed twice as much ungulate biomass per day as canids in packs dominated by eastern coyote ancestry. So we know that these canids with more wolf DNA are serving that more wolf-like role in our ecosystems. And broadly comparing regional populations, northeastern coyotes eat more deer than their western counterparts, and they're also found in a study in Ontario found that wolf ancestry of admixed canids also was positively associated with moose density as well. So we see them occupying at a micro scale kind of, more wolf DNA means they're preying more on these larger species and occupying habitat where those larger species exist. So I'm going to shift gears and I guess tell you why I took you down the taxonomic wormhole that we just went down. And kind of shift to the policy frameworks that manage these species and these admixed canids. So two very varying ways that wolves and coyotes are regulated and managed broadly across the country. So wolves, and I say this with a big caveat that this is at the current moment, wolves are federally protected, but there's attempts currently within U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and legislatively to try to delist wolves, so this could change in the very near future. But at the current moment, wolves are federally protected and they're listed as endangered on the Endangered Species Act. So that provides them the strongest protections that really a species in the U.S. can have, which is Section 9 of the ESA prohibits take. So you can't harass, hunt, shoot, capture, trap, kill a wolf, and these are all prohibited. On the flip side of that, coyotes are essentially unprotected and receive some of the most lenient protections or lack thereof protections of any species in the United States. So just focusing here in the Northeast, in Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine, there's a year-round open season on coyotes, no bag limits, things like night hunting are allowed. In New York, there is somewhat of a limited season, October 1st to March 31st, but also no bag limits and things like night hunting are allowed. So two very different policy frameworks that are managing these species. And the reason that this creates, a critical problem here in the Northeast is mistaken identity killings, which in the last 20 years, I meant to warn you that there's some dead canids on the next slide. But in the last 20 years, multiple wolves have been shot and killed in the Northeast under the assumption that they were coyotes. And so what I'll say is that, everywhere in the US, mistaken identity of coyotes, of wolves being killed because they were mistaken as coyotes is actually a problem. But here in the Northeast, it's an even larger problem because of that admixture that we have within these canids. So it's exceptionally difficult for an individual to be able to identify a wolf from a coyote in the field, especially when things like night hunting are allowed and the lack thereof regulations for coyotes. So this is a fairly, I guess famous in my world, but a fairly famous case of a wolf that was shot and killed in Cooperstown, New York. And it happened fairly recently in 2021. And so this individual was out coyote hunting and thought that he was shooting at a coyote, later confirmed to be 98% wolf DNA. And that animal is actually now, the taxidermy of that animal is now at a museum in the Albany area. And there's a really interesting and fascinating exhibit on kind of wolves and coyotes in the Northeast, if you're interested. So what this displays, and I'll just say that the other two canids on these slides are just pictures that we've received, but those animals were killed and written off as coyotes, but we don't have DNA testing of those. But obviously, you know, the canid in the middle is a very large canid, but unfortunately the hunter wasn't willing to give a DNA sample. So not certain on what that animal exactly is, ancestry-wise. So what this displays is that wolves are really, I would say, knocking at our door. Some dozen wolves have been killed in the Northeast over the last quarter century. So nature really seems to recognize that, as coyotes kind of already have, that there's really a vacuum for an apex predator or a top carnivore species in the Northeast. However, the single barrier to recovery of wolves really is our public policy on coyotes, and that's kind of my main takeaway from this that I hope is coming across. So while agencies recognize the ecological benefits of our coyotes, they're also aggressively managing them essentially as a nuisance species and allowing, you know, pretty unlimited take of them. And distinguishing a large coyote from a wolf takes very exceptional observational skills and is likely, you know, in the case of these animals, likely just not realistic to say that a hunter could identify the two species in the field. And this is something that our wildlife agencies do agree with us on. So about 10 years ago, when the last state wildlife action plan was being updated, the species assessment for gray wolves, which are listed in Vermont as a species of greatest conservation need, they identified that, you know, this is a quote from their species assessment saying, the ability of coyote hunters in the Northeast to effectively discern wolves from coyotes in the field may also influence the likelihood of natural wolf recolonization, and went on to explain that the mistaken identity killings are going to be a major you know, barrier to wolf recovery in the Northeast because coyote hunters and because coyotes are so aggressively hunted. So I'm going to zoom in on that closest breeding populations of wolves that I mentioned before, which is the eastern wolves in southern Ontario. So that's in Algonquin Provincial Park, which is essentially like a national park in Canada. And they're approximately, their density of breeding populations is approximately 100 miles from the New York border. And like I mentioned, in New York, in the US, they're considered a subspecies, but in Canada, they are considered their own distinct species, and they are protected under their kind of Endangered Species Act at the federal level in Canada. However, their range is very fragmented, and it's largely restricted to within Algonquin Provincial Park, as well as some of the adjacent provincial parks in the region. And the biggest threat that research has shown to eastern wolves and to their dispersal, kind of restricting their dispersal outside of the park, is really human-caused mortality that's happening outside of those provincial park areas. So recreational hunting and trapping in Ontario continues to drive what's essentially the hybridization of coyotes and wolves, because as we're killing eastern wolves and coyotes, they tend to hybridize more with one another because they have difficulty finding a species of an individual of the same species. And so currently, there is a buffer zone around Algonquin Provincial Park that prohibits hunting and trapping of all canids, and that's because of that, you know, difficulty of distinguishing between the two species. Canada's acknowledged that in order to protect the one species, you're going to have to ban trapping and hunting of both species. And this is really aimed at obviously reducing that mortality and allowing genetic dispersal outside of Algonquin Provincial Park. But it's still very limited, and there's many miles of unprotected, you know, outside of that buffer zone that wolves would have to disperse in order to get to the Northeast. So I'll end on kind of a summary, and then would love to get into questions if anyone has any. So to support, you know, rewilding, like help wolves rewild the Northeast, these are kind of the key takeaways that I have of how we support that work. And obviously I think this has come across, but really by now we need to be protecting all wild Canis. And because of that intense hybridization that's happened between wolves and coyotes and the difficulty of distinguishing them in the field, protecting both species makes sense. It also makes sense because, like we touched on, our eastern coyotes are actually serving a bit of that ecological role of apex predator, and we should cherish and support that ecological benefit of coyotes on the landscape. And protecting them will allow wolves to be able to disperse and recover the region as well. And then the other big part of this is my call to always keep wolves on the Federal Endangered Species Act. I think it's, I'll say I'm opinionated, but silly that you would only have wolves recover 10% of their former range and call that recovery. I think wolves, still have a vast amount of range that they have not recovered in since being extirpated from the land, from those regions. And so keeping wolves on the Federal Endangered Species Act is a very important piece of the puzzle in order to help them recover in the Northeast. And then the other bit of this, and I mentioned Bridget Van Holt, that is a canid geneticist that we partner with at Princeton University. We really need more research and DNA analysis of wild Canis in the Northeast. The research that I showed on this hybridization, some of it's fairly outdated, and we do have more recent ancestry work that's being done. We actually have a new non-invasive sampling method that essentially you can look at the ancestry of canids by analyzing their scat samples, which is a really cool, I don't know how it happens. Again, I'm not a geneticist, but I do know that when we send scat samples in, they come back to us with ancestry information, which is really fascinating. So we're working on gathering kind of more data on what the genetic makeup is of canids in the Northeast, and if there are pockets of, our kind of research question that we're hoping to answer is maybe there are pockets in northern Maine or the Adirondacks that do have animals that have much higher percentages of wolf ancestry, and those are open questions that we hope this genetic research will start to answer. And then the general call, obviously my organization focuses on fostering coexistence with wild carnivores, coyotes and wolves alike. And so always working on increasing social tolerance and public perception of these species, which have immense benefits to our ecosystems, but are also just intrinsic in their own right to exist. So continuing to work on kind of rolling back negative attitudes and promoting more positive relationship with coyotes and wild carnivores. And yeah, I will mention one piece of legislation that we've been working on in New York is actually a bill that would help support some of that genetic research throughout the Adirondacks in particular. So that was introduced last legislative session, and we actually got word that it's been reintroduced by our sponsor this year as well. So just one call for kind of supporting legislation that helps kind of promote this research work on canids in the Northeast. And then we also formed the Northeast Wolf Recovery Alliance. So there's a collection of organizations and conservation groups throughout all of the Northeast states, as well as some national groups that have kind of banded together on really promoting wolf recovery in the region, supporting that DNA research, and also proactively working on helping to reform coyote regulations in particular in the Northeast to help support wolf recovery. So if you want to look up the Northeast Wolf Recovery Alliance, you can kind of get a peek into the work that we're doing. And that's it. So I'll open it to questions.
Okay, so I remember your slide about the Endangered Species Act. It was like a timeline with the red and blue.
Yeah.
I'm wondering why there's such a fluctuation in caring about whether or not the act is out, why does it keep getting taken away, and why does it keep getting reinforced, and why can't the care and protection be more consistent?
Yeah, super good question. We actually we have like a term for that. We call it the predator pendulum in particular, which is just these swings between wolves being listed as endangered and then like removing their protections, and then they're open to hunting seasons and trapping, and then they get swing back. And that really is just because we live in a super political divisive kind of climate. And so the swings of the administration, as a new administration comes in, typically brings in a new U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service appointee, a new appointee to the Department of the Interior. And so unfortunately, the policy frameworks that support these species just swing with those administration shifts. I wish it was more consistent. I wish we could, agree that wolves as a species should be protected regardless of, I wish that wasn't a partisan issue, but unfortunately it is. And so that's kind of why we see those swings back and forth. Oh yeah.
Besides like the population, is there any other like justification for night hunting of coyotes in those states because night hunting is so dangerous?
No, you make a good point there. It is very dangerous, and we actually see most, I talked about mistaken identity of wolves and coyotes, but we also have fairly common across the country is mistaken identity of coyotes and dogs. And there's, a whole slew of stories that come out each year, even, I think Massachusetts, Connecticut last year, where coyote hunters actually mistake, people's companion animals for coyotes and ended up killing companion animals. I would say that there's no good justification for night hunting. I think it increases the chances of, wolves being shot and killed, companion animals being shot and killed, but also hunting, accidents with humans as well. And so I think generally we just have a very open way in which we approach coyote hunting, which is very unregulated. And so I think historically they've allowed night hunting, and it's just hasn't been addressed. So, yeah.
You said that the wolves around here are blend, and I was just curious whether anybody's observed their behavior, if they exhibit more of the coyote style behavior where they can be alone, or whether they're more pack-like, like wolves.
Yeah, I would say they need a lot more research on, it'd be great to have collaring data on, and compare that to genetic data to look at behavioral variation of kind of admixed canids and those with more wolf DNA and more coyote DNA. We do know from some research that, I think I mentioned, like on a geographic scale, we know that canids with more wolf ancestry are really selecting for habitats with that larger prey base. So we do see that. I'm not familiar with research in terms of, more wolf ancestry if we're seeing larger packs with those animals in particular. So I would say we need more research around that. And it's definitely a really good question that, I hope we get more answers to. Yeah.
Is there any particular reason why the gray wolves are so much bigger than a lot of like the Great Lakes ones and such? Because of the diet or the range?
Yeah, so that's a super good question, and I probably skipped over that a little bit with that taxonomic chart. But so the Great Lakes wolves are actually also kind of an admixed canid, right? So they're a mix between gray wolves and then that eastern wolf, which is a smaller bodied wolf. And so that's kind of what we call that admixture is a Great Lakes wolf. So it's just kind of the convergence of those two species or subspecies, depending on who you talk to. But that's the reason for kind of those smaller bodied animals, yeah.
I remember you saying something along the lines of how the wolves respond to killing with more reproduction, so it kind of was it coyote? Oh, okay, coyote. Thank you. I'm wondering, is that a genetic or hormonal response, or do they do this consciously?
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's super fascinating. So it's coyotes in particular. Wolves don't have this response to mortality like coyotes do. So there's a few ways by which that happens. One is that we have found that coyotes have what we call like an autogenic trait, genetic trait, that actually, we will see if there's available habitat and prey in an ecosystem, and a lot of coyotes have been killed in a given ecosystem, we'll see larger litter sizes of the coyotes that then go on to reproduce. And we think that's because of that autogenic trait, which is that they know that there's available habitat, they see that there's available prey, they know they could feed more pups, so they actually end up having larger litter sizes. So stable packs will have, on average, about 5 pups, or sometimes less, 3 to 5 pups. In areas that are heavily hunted, where coyotes are heavily hunted and trapped, we'll see litter sizes up to 18 pups, which is really crazy. Imagine having 18 kids, right? It's crazy. So we see this just stark kind of difference in the actual litter sizes. But it's also because of that social structure that's fracturing. And so maybe I'll just go back to that slide. So when we see like lethal interventions, right, which is killing of various pack members, instead of on the left, which is a stable social structure of a coyote family, you really have your top breeding pair that's breeding, and then you don't really have any other breeding pair within that social structure. But when it's fractured, what ends up happening is that multiple members of that social structure will then go off and create breeding pairs. And so you'll have multiple members and breeding pairs, so it just essentially creates more pups. Yeah, so really fascinating. And it's why they had that massive range expansion when we saw wolves, populations decrease. We saw coyotes be able to expand across North America. Yeah.
In the areas that like the coyotes see like the larger pup numbers, how many of those pups actually survive into adulthood?
Yeah, that varies based on, there's different studies across the country, based on habitat and prey and whether there's still, practices to hunt and trap coyotes in those regions. So it really varies. On average, it's hard to say. In Yellowstone National Park, we see like a 60% pup survival. And that's, coyotes that aren't really being hunted and trapped, but have other, instances of mortality in the population. So yeah, it's hard to say because it just varies based on the ecosystem that they're in.
Yeah.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned bounty killing, and we had a victory in this state a few years ago when we outlawed bounty killing of coyotes. But we still have a practice, and a lot of people don't even know this is legal here, but we still have a practice of hunting coyotes with hounds. We don't even call it hunting, we also say killing with hounds. And we have a precedent here 25, 30 years ago where we outlawed that practice with bears. And I'm wondering if your organization has had any involvement in maybe some legislative action trying to outlaw killing coyotes with hounds.
Yeah, we have. We've worked on hounding legislation in other states. We have a Vermont state representative that's working actually on a bill right now in Vermont to outlaw the practice of hounding coyotes. I would say in general, hounding also, we've seen in Vermont, and I'm sure it might be true in Massachusetts as well, which is, it creates a lot of landowner conflict too, right? These are hounds that go out and they're sometimes can travel like miles away from their owner. And we're not really sure how coyotes are dying in those instances or if other animals or species are being targeted, right? Because they're not able to actually observe their hounds in the field a lot of times. So yeah, we definitely work on outlawing hounding. It's one of the many practices that coyotes are, subjected to on public lands across the country that we definitely are in support of banning. So, yeah.
Has there been any signs of progress regarding changing those coyote hunting regulations in line with what they're doing up in Canada?
Yeah. Not yet in the Northeast. We're definitely pushing for them. I'll say, right now all states across the country are going through the updating of their state wildlife action plans, which essentially is looking at species of greatest conservation need that are identified within the state. And in the Northeast, it varies by state, but in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine, wolves are actually listed as species of greatest conservation need, although they're extinct from the states. And so it's opening an opportunity for us to have more conversations with the agency on taking more proactive steps to limit coyote hunting regulations. But nothing has kind of, yet come from that. But I would say that we're definitely talking to the agencies. They've definitely heard from us. We've written a lot of letters and communications around why we think this is a, good action for them to take is to limit coyote hunting. So hopefully.
Hi. In your communities, do you ever talk about some of these areas that you're studying with the animals? Do you ever look into like human population numbers or changes or anything like that?
In relation to coyotes or?
Yeah, in relation to some of those areas that you're studying the coyote growth, the wolf, growth or expansion. I don't know, like, does that ever come up in any of the conversations?
I mean, we do know that there's like a negative correlation between coyotes are able to thrive in really human dense areas. And we've seen that adaptability from coyotes as a species in particular. We've seen a negative correlation with wolves. They're not as able to easily adapt to human dominated landscapes. And so part of that's that pack structure. They have larger territory ranges than coyotes do in super dense habitat. Coyotes can really stay in a kind of small home range size, whereas wolves travel much longer distances and kind of pack territories. So I would say that's the kind of research where we've seen maybe some distinctions between the two species and how they're able to adapt to human presence on the landscape. Yeah.
I remember you saying that part of your work is educating the public about coyotes. So I'm curious about some of the common myths you hear about coyotes that perpetuate negative public perceptions of them.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, we hear a lot. A lot goes on social media. I think there's certain practices that coyotes have that can be maybe trigger fear within humans, right? Because we're not sometimes used to the interactions that we'll see. So one thing in particular is during breeding season, coyotes do what's called kind of like a den guarding behavior. And so if you're in at a park and you're with your kind of companion animal or a dog, and they have a den nearby, sometimes coyotes will come out and watch and even follow you as you kind of walk, and it's called escorting behavior. They'll kind of walk with you, right? And that can be perceived, people will say some of the misperceptions is that they're trying to lure their companion animal away from them so they can, the coyotes can kill them, or that they're starting to surround them in order to attack, people. So some of those behaviors can kind of trigger a fear response in people, right? Because we're not used to it, but that's kind of, some of those myths and misperceptions. And then, one of the other ones is that, and coyotes do occasionally take companion animals, so they will, on outdoor cats or unleashed small dogs. There are instances where coyotes do come into conflict with small companion animals, and there's ways to prevent that. But that's obviously, as somebody who has both a cat and a dog, it's something that's, very close to my heart. We're losing a companion animal would be a difficult thing. So, those kind of situations, I think, further lead to negative attitudes towards them, unfortunately. So we kind of work on dispelling some of those kind of myths and misperceptions. And we do know that even in urban areas like Chicago or New York City, the cats or small dogs are not a significant portion of coyotes' diet, right? They're opportunistic. So if they do see an off-leash dog or cat, they would, potentially prey on those species. But we're talking less than 1% of their diet. So it's not a primary source of their diet. It's just more of an opportunistic situation occasionally.
With the coyotes taking over some of the role that the wolves did in the Northeast in our ecosystem, why should we want the wolves back, and what purpose does that serve them coming back here? Does it make our ecosystem more balanced? It seems like it's fairly balanced now, but what would they add to our ecosystem?
Totally, it's a super good question, and I think it's funny because wolf recovery in the Northeast doesn't have a simple answer because we do have admixed canids now, right? So you're talking about I think for some species, when you think about potentially bringing mountain lions back to the Northeast, it would be mountain lions aren't here, bringing them back would be getting mountain lions, reintroducing them, and then allowing there. But in the Northeast, it's more of a rewilding on maybe not as of a direct reintroduction scale, right? It's allowing wolves to restore kind of their genetic ancestry potentially into the existing canid population in the Northeast. And I would say that, the research that we do have on those canids with higher wolf ancestry is we're seeing them serve that more wolf-like role. So I think that would only continue to increase, right? More wolf ancestry, larger bodied canids would be able to take down more large prey more consistently, right? So deer overpopulation or, help with deer population more broadly across the Northeast if we had more wolf DNA in our existing canid population. So I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
On the subject of humans promoting coexistence with wolves, what human behaviors would need to change to make that more reasonable besides hunting?
Definitely, yeah, so it varies. So, our educational work works both in urban communities, so that Coyote Friendly Communities program, right? So in urban communities, we're typically helping to teach people how to secure their backyard chickens, right? And it could be more suburban, I guess, communities as well, but also, not to walk their dogs off leash, especially in public park areas, right? Where they might come into conflicts with coyotes, trying to, not have outdoor cats that could come into cuts. So those are some of the coexistence practices and the urban scale. But we also have a ranching and farming with wildlife program that works with folks in agricultural landscapes on, best husbandry practices for kind of using non-lethal deterrence instead of using kind of lethal responses to conflict. So, we're a big proponent of things like livestock guardian dogs for folks who have sheep farms or cattle operations, as well as, electrified fencing, fladgery, fox lights. These are all kind of tools in the toolkit for farmers and ranchers to be able to use in practice. And they're not always perfect, and it takes a very varied response. But that's kind of what our Ranching and Farming with Wildlife program does, is try to work with communities, farming communities on the landscape in order to kind of get them a non-lethal, to transition to that non-lethal kind of response.
And so I often go hiking at dusk at low, and I'm familiar with the den guarding behavior coyotes. Are wolves significantly different or similar?
With like den guarding behavior?
Yeah. Or out hiking by yourself? And are there times a day you want to not be near wolves?
Yeah, good question. I would say see less interactions with people and wolves just generally because, coyotes are existing near kind of urban communities. So I haven't heard of den guarding behavior with wolves in particular, but all animals are, naturally like, Canis species are more active at dawn and dusk. So for people who are fearful of those species, we say, you can avoid like those times of days in, kind of for hiking or recreating on public lands. But also I would say too that, there's been one documented killing, human who died of a wolf attack in the last, 90, 100 years in the United States too. So we're talking of very rare instances of actual kind of human fatalities that are happening from wolves, so.
Okay, Mike, we both out of questions and out of time, which is perfect. So thank you all for the excellent questions and for coming, and thanks so much to Renee for the excellent presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much.